The sun had barely risen when I heard the first knock, slow, heavy, and strangely confident. It wasn't the kind of knock a neighbor gives. It was the kind of knock someone gives when they think they already own what's behind the door. I wiped the sawdust off my hands, stepped over the half-finished wooden posts in my backyard, and made my way to the front. I opened the door, and there they were, 3 HOA board members lined up like a firing squad. Clipboards. Phones recording. Smirks ready. For a moment, none of them spoke. They just stared at me, at my yard, at the construction going on behind me. Finally, the president, Linda, the self-appointed queen of the community, stepped forward. "You're in violation of HOA regulations 3A, 7C, and 12B, she said, as if she'd memorized them all night. "You are not permitted to build any structure without written approval. This is illegal construction." I took a breath. "Linda, this isn't HOA property." She scoffed. "Everything within this boundary falls under HOA oversight. You signed the agreement when you bought the house." "Except." "I didn't. I bought the land before the HOA existed. My property line wrapped behind several houses, but the previous owners never fenced it, so for years, the HOA assumed it was part of the community green space. They mowed it, decorated it, even held Easter egg hunts on it. But it was mine. Every inch. When I started building a small workshop on it, they panicked, not because I broke a rule, but because I reminded them of something they had forgotten: land has an owner. I told them again. Calmly. This land is not under HOA jurisdiction. Linda's smile turned sharp. Then we'll let the police decide. She snapped her fingers like it was a royal decree. Call them. No problem, I said. Call them. 15 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up. Lights on. Neighbors stepping out to watch. HOA cameras recording. The whole street buzzing with whispers. It was ridiculous. I wasn't a criminal. I was building a workshop. On my land. But the HOA wanted a show, and they got one. The officers walked up, and before I could say a word, Linda rushed forward like she'd been rehearsing her speech in the mirror. "Officers, this resident is conducting illegal construction on HOA-controlled property. He's trespassing. He's defying community rules. We want the construction shut down immediately." One officer looked at me. "Sir, is this true?" I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just walked inside, grabbed the thick brown envelope that had lived in my drawer for years, and handed it to him. "My deed," I said. "Full survey included. That land behind my house. It's not HOA property. It's mine." Linda laughed. "Please. That can't be right." The officer held up a hand. "We'll take a look." Suddenly the neighborhood went quiet. Everyone leaned in. Even the birds seemed to hush. The officer slowly unfolded the map, scanned the coordinates, traced the marked lines with his finger. His expression changed. First confusion. Then realization. Then a slow, undeniable shift as the truth hit him like a weight. He raised his head. Looked at me. Then looked at the HOA. The officer stared at the map for a long moment, his brows slowly knitting together as he followed the boundary line again and again, as if making sure his eyes weren't tricking him. Finally he exhaled and folded the survey neatly, like someone who understood the gravity of what he was about to say. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "I don't know how to put this nicely, but you and your board are standing on his land." The silence was brutal. Linda blinked. "Excuse me." The officer tapped the map. "This entire section, everything behind his house, everything you've been calling community property, belongs to him. Not the HOA. Not the neighborhood. Him." He pointed directly at me. "And he's not trespassing. He's standing on his own property. The HOA board members looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under their feet. Their smugness evaporated. Their cameras lowered. Their confidence cracked. But Linda wasn't done. She crossed her arms, trying to hold on to the last thread of control. "Officer, this must be a mistake. Our community map clearly includes that area." "That map," the officer cut in, "isn't a legal survey. This deed is." He handed her a copy of the boundary outline I kept with the envelope. She snatched it and scanned it as if sheer disbelief could change reality. I could see her struggling with the math, the dates, the signature stamps. "This isn't possible," she muttered. But it was. Because here's what the HOA had never bothered to check: the land I owned extended behind my home because the developer sold the lots unevenly decades ago. My land wrapped behind theirs in a strange L shape. Nobody noticed because nobody cared, until I decided to build on it. The officer turned to me. "Sir, you're within your rights to continue construction." The crowd of neighbors whispered loudly now. Some were shocked. Some amused. A few looked embarrassed. They had picnic tables on my grass. Linda's face twisted. "Officer, this doesn't change the fact that he didn't submit any construction request." "He doesn't need to," the officer said calmly. "This land is outside HOA jurisdiction." That sentence hit her like a hammer. She opened her mouth again, but the officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we were called here for a trespassing complaint. But the only trespassers today are the ones standing on his property without permission." The board members stepped back instinctively. It was almost funny. Then the officer looked at me again. "Do you want to file a complaint?" That question hung in the air. I could have done it. I could have pushed it further. Complaints. Fines. Legal trouble for years of misuse. But revenge wasn't the point. Respect was. Boundaries, literal and otherwise, were. I shook my head. "Not today. I just want them to stay off my property." The officer nodded. "I'll make that clear." He walked toward the HOA members, giving them what I can only describe as the most polite scolding they'd ever received. "From this moment on, you will not step onto this land without his permission. Any disputes you have, take them to civil court. But do not misuse police authority again." Neighbors gasped. Phones recorded. The HOA's pride shattered right there in the dirt. But the real storm? That arrived in the days that followed. When the HOA realized losing control of my land meant losing something far more important. The power they thought they had. For a day or two, the neighborhood felt strangely calm, too calm, the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm tears through. I kept working on my workshop, leveling the foundation, setting the beams, pretending life had gone back to normal. But HOAs don't lose quietly. Especially not one run by Linda. Their pride had been bruised in front of neighbors, cops, and cameras. And when people like her feel powerless, they don't step back, they dig their nails in deeper. The first sign of trouble came as I hauled a load of lumber along the side of the house. Someone had placed a stack of printed HOA violation notices on my porch. Not mailed. Not taped. Physically stacked in a neat little pile, 25 copies of the exact same urgent compliance warning. Each one stamped aggressively in red. Each one signed by Linda. Each one accusing me of disrupting community harmony, performing unsafe construction, and, ironically, obstructing community property. They were trying to pretend the police incident hadn't happened. Pretending the deed didn't exist. Pretending they could intimidate me back into silence. I tossed the papers aside, but the next morning, something else happened. The landscaping crew, contracted by the HOA, showed up. Not on the HOA's greenbelt. Not in the common areas. On my land. Right where my workshop foundation sat. They weren't mowing, they were cutting. Slashing. destroying the markers that surveyed the property line, pulling up posts, ripping orange flags from the ground. And leading them? Linda's husband, Charles, giving directions like a general on a battlefield he thought he owned. I walked straight toward them. "This is private property," I said, loud enough for every crew member to hear. "You're trespassing." Charles didn't even turn around. "We're maintaining community grounds. You can't stop us." I pulled out my phone and hit record. "The police were here 2 days ago. They told you this land is mine." That made him turn. His face burned red. "We're correcting an error," he snapped. "The HOA doesn't recognize your so-called deed." I almost laughed. "You don't get to recognize legal documents. You follow them." He waved his crew forward. "Finish the job." And that's when I realized, this wasn't incompetence. This was war. They couldn't win on paper, so they were trying to erase the battle lines physically. If they destroyed the survey markers, they could later claim confusion. If they ruined the construction site, they could force delays. If they kept harassing me, maybe I'd get tired, maybe I'd give up, maybe I'd sell, and then the HOA could reassess boundaries, quietly. But they didn't understand something about me. I wasn't building a workshop because I needed space. I was building it because it was the first time since moving here that I felt like I was finally claiming something for myself, something real, something earned. I wasn't about to let a handful of power-hungry board members bully me off my own soil. So I dialed the police again. This time, 2 officers arrived. Not the ones from before, these seemed more irritated than calm. They listened to both sides. They saw the torn markers, the damaged ground, the ripped survey flags lying like casualties in the dirt. They reviewed the deed again. And then the lead officer turned to Charles. "You were warned about this. You cannot step onto this property." Charles clenched his jaw. "We're maintaining the community." "You're violating a trespass warning," the officer interrupted. "And if you don't walk off this land right now, you will be charged." The crew froze. You could feel the tension in the air break like glass. Slowly, unwillingly, Charles signaled his men to retreat. They gathered their tools, muttering under their breath, and backed away. Linda watched from across the street, her face pale, her posture stiff, her illusion of control cracking again, but this time, the fracture went deeper. Because now, the entire neighborhood saw what was really happening, not a rule violation, but an HOA drunk on power, pushing boundaries that didn't belong to them. But they weren't done. Losing control wasn't something people like them accepted easily. And the next move they made, was the one that pushed everything past the point of no return. The retreat of the landscaping crew should have ended things. Any reasonable group would have cut their losses and backed off after being warned twice by the police. But the HOA wasn't reasonable anymore. They were desperate, humiliated, and hungry to get back the control they once believed was theirs by birthright. And desperate people make dangerous decisions. For 3 days, things stayed tense but quiet. Neighbors whispered more openly. Some approached me privately, apologizing for what the HOA had done. Others avoided me entirely, afraid of choosing sides. I kept building, trying to focus on the hammer in my hand instead of the eyes watching from porches. But even with the progress on the workshop coming along, walls framed, roof beams in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing behind the scenes. And I was right. On the 4th evening, just as the sun began melting into the horizon, I received a letter in the mail. Not an ordinary letter. A certified one. Thick, official-looking, stamped with a legal firm's name I didn't recognize. Inside was a demand: cease construction immediately. According to them, the HOA was pursuing emergency legal action to seize the portion of my land historically used as community property. They claimed they had established rights through long-term public use. And until the court ruled, they insisted I was prohibited from altering the contested land. I read the entire letter twice before I laughed, an exhausted, frustrated laugh that felt like it came from somewhere buried deep. They had nothing. No legal claim. No written agreement. No right to anything. Yet they were trying to weaponize the complicated language of lawyers to intimidate me, hoping I'd freeze up and stop building. I wasn't freezing. I was done. I marched straight to the HOA office, the small beige building near the clubhouse that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. The board was inside, holding a meeting. I didn't knock, I walked right in. They stared at me like I'd entered a secret chamber I wasn't supposed to see. Linda stood up first. "You can't be in here. This is an HOA member meeting." "I'm not an HOA member," I said, closing the door behind me. "Remember?" Her jaw tightened. "You received our legal notice." "I received your attempt to scare me," I corrected. "That land is mine. Every survey, deed, and officer confirms it. You can't take it. You can't touch it. And you can't threaten your way into controlling it." Charles stepped forward. "You are disrupting the integrity of the community." "No," I said, stepping closer. "You're disrupting my life." That made the room go silent. "I'm building a workshop. That's it. I've never hurt anyone. Never violated anything. And you," I pointed at the entire board, "have tried to turn this into some kind of territorial war because you can't handle being wrong." Linda slammed her palm on the table. "We are not wrong." "Then why did the police say you were trespassing?" I shot back. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Not a single one. But the moment I left the room, I knew something had shifted. Not in my favor. In theirs. I had embarrassed them in front of their board. Again. And people like Linda don't forget embarrassment, they weaponize it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of anticipation. My gut told me the HOA wasn't waiting for lawyers. They were done playing by any rule at all. And when authority fails them, people like them turn to chaos. The next morning, my fear became real. I stepped outside and froze. My workshop, my half-built dream, was destroyed. Walls kicked in. Boards snapped. Roof beams lying in the dirt like broken bones. And spray-painted across the wood, in dripping red letters, was a message that sent a chill through my spine. Stop or else. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was war. And war meant I was done being patient. The morning I saw the destruction, my stomach turned over. Every board, every beam, every carefully measured post of my half-built workshop lay in a heap of splintered wood and shattered dreams. And the spray-painted warning taunted me like a predator circling its prey. But fear? No. That had vanished long ago. In its place burned a resolve stronger than any HOA rule or petty act of vengeance. I had called the police again, but by the time they arrived, Linda and her crew had fled, leaving behind only chaos and arrogance. They had escalated, but they had underestimated me. I documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. Every piece of broken wood, every red letter of that menacing message. I spoke with the officers, showing them the original deed and survey maps, along with the footage of their landscaping crew trespassing just days before. The officers' faces told me everything. This wasn't just trespassing anymore, it was criminal damage. They nodded gravely, as if finally realizing how far the HOA had crossed the line. "We'll make sure this is handled legally," the lead officer promised. And for the first time in days, I felt a small surge of relief. Not just because the law was on my side, but because justice was finally catching up. The HOA tried their usual tactics next. Emails. Phone calls. Threats of legal action. But this time, I didn't flinch. I had an airtight case, a paper trail, and police involvement. I even reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. One meeting, a cup of strong coffee, and 5 minutes of reviewing my documents, and he leaned back with a slow smile. They've painted themselves into a corner. Every move they've made is now evidence. And you've got the upper hand. The following week, the HOA president attempted a face-to-face confrontation, thinking she could intimidate me in front of neighbors. She stepped onto my driveway with a clipboard and her usual air of superiority. I met her at the edge of my property, the morning sun casting long shadows behind me. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just stood there, calm, unyielding, and pointed to the survey stakes marking my land. "This is mine," I said simply. "Every inch. Anything beyond this line is trespassing, and you've already proved that you ignore laws. I've already spoken to the police. I suggest you leave before this escalates further." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked like someone realizing the chessboard had shifted and all her pieces were trapped. Around us, neighbors peeked from windows, some secretly filming, others whispering among themselves. Humiliation, I realized, was a weapon in itself. The HOA couldn't hide their repeated failures. Their arrogance, their overreach, and their outright lawbreaking had been exposed. The final blow came in court. Not mine, the HOA's. After their desperate attempt to claim public use rights failed spectacularly, they were ordered to pay restitution for the damage they caused, remove all illegal structures on my property, and legally acknowledge my land ownership. The judge's words rang like a bell: property rights are not subject to opinion, tradition, or intimidation. They are legally protected. The plaintiff owns the land in question. I returned home that afternoon, walking slowly through my yard, surveying the cleared space where my workshop had been rebuilt stronger than before. The police had followed up, neighbors had congratulated me discreetly, and even a few board members avoided my gaze entirely. I set the first post of the rebuilt workshop, hammered it in with a satisfying thud, and realized something far greater than legal victory had been won: respect. Respect from the officers, from neighbors, and most importantly, from myself. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the yard, I paused to look at my property. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was a statement. A reminder that rules exist to protect, not to intimidate. That ownership, when defended calmly but firmly, outweighs arrogance. And that sometimes, standing your ground against those who misuse power doesn't just win land, it wins dignity. Linda never stepped foot on that property again. The HOA's attempts to challenge me vanished one by one, and the neighborhood slowly adjusted to the truth: I owned the land. And for the first time in months, I felt a rare, deep peace. I poured myself a cup of coffee, leaned against the half-built wall of my workshop, and watched the sun rise over what was now undeniably mine. Not because I was lucky, not because they made a mistake, but because I refused to back down, refused to be intimidated, and refused to let anyone, HOA, neighbors, or anyone else, erase what was rightfully mine. Victory wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. But it was mine. Every inch of it.